1,000 years ago, Norse longships cut through icy Atlantic waters, driven by the hope of discovery. They arrived not in Europe, but in the New World, a place we now call North America. Their destination? Vinland. Their goal? A new home. But the story didn't go as planned. Within a few years, the settlers vanished. What happened after the Vikings clashed with Native Americans? Why did they leave? And what legacy did they leave behind? Today we dive into one of the most intriguing historical mysteries of the Viking Age. Long before Columbus drew his first map, a different kind of ship cut through the fog of the North Atlantic. Not a Spanish caravel seeking gold and glory for a king, but a Norse knar, a sturdy, broad-beamed merchant ship. On board were not just warriors, but families, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, children. They were pioneers, pushed from their homelands in Norway by consolidating kings and shrinking opportunities, seeking not plunder, but a place to live, a place to build, a place to be free. They were the Greenlanders. And after centuries on the icy fringe of the world, they found it. A land of impossible green, teeming with life, a place they called Vinland. They built homes of turf and timber, forged iron in a stone hearth, and a child was born. Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European in the Americas. They had the skills, the technology, and the will to succeed. But within a generation they were gone. The settlement was abandoned. The dream was dead. The history books give us a simple answer. They fought with the native inhabitants and left. But that single sentence papers over a saga of terror, misunderstanding, and a clash of worlds so total, it's difficult to comprehend. This wasn't a story of a simple battle. It was a story of a silent, creeping dread, a war of shadows, and a psychological defeat that no iron sword could prevent. What really happened on those shores? Why did they abandon a paradise they had sought for so long? To find the answer, we have to look past the myths. We have to understand not just how the Vikings fought, but how they lived, how they thought, and what they truly feared. This is the story of what happened after the Vikings battled the Native Americans. A story of retreat, collapse, and a mystery that echoes to this day. Our story begins not in Vinland, but on the very edge of the known world, Greenland, settled in the late 10th century by the infamous Erik the Red, a man exiled from Norway, then exiled from Iceland for killing his neighbours. The Norse colony here was a testament to human endurance. It was a life lived on the margins of survival. The settlers established two main colonies, the larger eastern settlement and the more remote western settlement, in the only fjords that could support their European way of life. They farmed a thin, unforgiving soil, raising cattle, sheep and goats. They hunted seals and caribou. But their existence was utterly dependent on a fragile link to Europe, a perilous sea journey of over 1,000 miles for essentials, like iron, grain and timber, for anything larger than a bush. It was a life of constant, grinding hardship. And that brings us to our first curveball. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland wasn't just a quest for glory, as the sagas might suggest. It was a business decision, born of desperate necessity. The sagas tell us a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was the first to see the new land. Around the year 986, while attempting to sail from Iceland to join his father in the new Greenland colony, his ship was caught in a storm. For days they were lost in a sea of fog. When the sun finally returned, they were hopelessly off course. They sighted a coastline, but it wasn't the Greenland they expected. It was low-lying and covered in trees. To a Greenlander, living in a world of rock and ice where timber had to be imported at enormous cost or scavenged from precious driftwood, this was like finding a vein of pure gold. Bjarni, eager to reach his family, didn't land. But the story he told back in Greenland, of a land of wood to the west, lit a fire in the mind of Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red. Leif was a shrewd man. He saw the potential immediately. He bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35, and set out to retrace the route in reverse. Using the sun, the stars, and an intimate knowledge of wind, waves, and bird flight, he sailed west. What he found was beyond his wildest dreams. First, a land of flat stones and glaciers, he called Helluland, or Stone Slab Land, likely Baffin Island. Then, further south, a land of flat beaches and dense forest he named Markland, or Forest Land, likely the coast of Labrador. And finally he found Vinland. The name itself, Vinland, has been debated for centuries. Does it mean wineland from the wild grapes they found growing there? Or pasture land, from the Old Norse word vin with a short I? In truth, it could have been both, and to the Norse it was paradise either way. The rivers were choked with salmon larger than any they had ever seen. The forest offered a seemingly endless supply of high-quality timber. The climate was so mild that cattle could graze outdoors year-round. After a winter of exploration, Leif returned to Greenland with a ship laden with timber and grapes, a cargo so valuable it would have made him a wealthy man. He had proven it was real. The potential was enormous. This wasn't just a new home, it was a solution to Greenland's biggest problems. Vinland could provide the resources, especially wood and iron ore, that would make the Greenland colony not just viable, but prosperous. The plan wasn't just to settle, it was to create a permanent base of operations, a logging camp, a trading outpost, a vital new artery for the entire Norse Atlantic world. They were ready to invest, and they did. The next expedition was a far more serious affair, led by a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. This was no small scouting party, it was a full-blown colonization attempt. 3 ships carrying somewhere between 160 and 250 people, including women, and all the livestock and tools needed to build a new society. They arrived at Leif's old camp, a place they called Leifsbudir, and began to build their future. But they were not alone. The land was already home. The sagas call the native people they encountered Skrailingar. It was a dismissive term, likely meaning wretches or screamers, a catch-all for the indigenous peoples they met. Today, based on the location and descriptions, we believe these people were likely the ancestors of the Micmac or the Beothuk, or perhaps the earlier Dorset culture. And they had lived on this land, in tune with its rhythms for thousands of years. The first meetings were a mixture of wonder and deep suspicion. The two cultures could not have been more different. The Norse, in their woven wool and leather, with their iron axes and swords, their long houses and their loud, bellowing cattle, must have seemed like beings from another dimension. The indigenous peoples, with their masterful birch bark canoes, their tools of stone and bone, and their intimate knowledge of every stream and animal track, were equally alien to the Norse. The sagas describe a cautious, silent trade. The natives, wrapped in furs, would paddle silently to the Norse camp and lay down their pelts. In return, the Norse offered dairy products like milk and cheese, and strips of red cloth, a colour the natives seemed to prize. But Karlsefni made a critical rule. Under no circumstances were they to trade their weapons. The iron swords and axes that could fell a tree in minutes were the ultimate expression of their power. They understood, on a fundamental level, the technological advantage they held. But this peace was fragile, built on a foundation of complete mutual misunderstanding. And it was shattered by a bull. One day during a trading session, Karlsefni's bull broke free from its pen. To the Norse, it was a domestic animal. To the natives, who had never seen a bovine in their lives, it was a 4-legged, horned monster. It let out a terrifying roar and charged towards their camp. They panicked and fled in their canoes. The trust, so carefully built, was irrevocably broken. To them it must have seemed like a deliberate act of aggression, a demon unleashed by these strange, pale-skinned newcomers. They vanished for 3 weeks. When they returned, it was not with furs to trade, but with a fleet of canoes and weapons in hand. The first battle had begun. And here we come to the heart of the mystery, and our second, most crucial curveball. The Vikings did not lose a conventional war. They were not driven out by a massive, organised army in a pitched battle. They were defeated by something far more insidious, a low-intensity, high-stress guerrilla conflict they were psychologically, tactically, and culturally unprepared for. Think about Viking warfare. It was direct, brutal, and personal. It was the shield wall, 2 armies lining up on an open field, locking their shields together to form a solid barrier, clashing with spear, axe, and sword. It was about strength, courage, holding the line, and the sheer, terrifying momentum of a disciplined charge. It was the warfare of the open fields of Europe. But in the dense, unfamiliar, seemingly endless forests of Vinland, the shield wall was useless. The enemy didn't line up. They didn't fight fair, according to Norse standards. They were masters of their own land. The Micmac and other Algonquian groups were expert hunters. They knew how to move silently through the undergrowth. how to use camouflage, how to strike from ambush, and disappear like ghosts. Their weapon of choice was the bow, and from the cover of the trees, their stone-tipped arrows were lethal. The sagas describe it perfectly, a litany of terror. The Norse would be working, felling trees or repairing a boat, and suddenly, a silent arrow would find its mark. A hunting party would venture into the woods and simply not return. Sentries would be found dead at dawn, a single arrow in the back. The attacks were small, constant, and utterly unpredictable. The sagas mention the natives using a strange weapon, a large dark ball hoisted on a pole, which they flung from a kind of catapult. It made a hideous noise and struck fear into the Norse. This could be a description of a demon head, a bag of rocks swung on a pole, a psychological weapon designed to terrify. This wasn't a war for land, it was a war on the Norse psyche. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every trip for water was a life or death risk. The endless, silent forest, which once seemed a paradise of resources, now became a green hell. The Vikings were warriors, yes, but they were also farmers and traders. They weren't professional soldiers trained for a constant state of high alert. The stress, the paranoia, the slow attrition of their numbers and their nerve, it was relentless. The sagas tell a remarkable story about Freydis Eiriksdottir, Leif's fierce and ruthless sister. During one surprise attack, the Norsemen, terrified by the war cries and the hail of arrows, broke ranks and began to flee. Freydis, who was heavily pregnant at the time, could not keep up. She shouted at them in disgust. "Why do you flee from such pitiful wretches, men like you, when you could likely slaughter them like cattle?" She grabbed the sword from a fallen kinsman, and seeing the natives advancing, she pulled out one of her breasts, slapped it with the flat of the blade, and let out a terrifying war cry. The sight of this wild, pregnant woman, seemingly unafraid of death, and performing this bizarre, aggressive ritual, so stunned the natives that they hesitated, and then fell back. This story is often told as an example of Viking courage and ferocity. But it's also a story of Viking desperation. Their men were running, their tactics were failing, their spirit was breaking. It took an extraordinary, almost insane act of defiance to momentarily turn the tide, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality. They were an island of settlers, in a hostile sea, and the tide was rising. Thorfinn Karlsefni was a practical man, an experienced merchant. He knew how to calculate profit and loss. He could count his dwindling people. He could see the fear in their eyes. He could measure the resources they were spending on defence, the time spent guarding the walls instead of felling timber, the iron used for arrowheads instead of nails. The Vinland settlement was no longer a profitable enterprise. It was a death trap. His wife, Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, had given birth to their son Snorri in Vinland. This child, the first European born in the Americas, should have been a symbol of a new beginning, the anchor of a new dynasty in a new land. Instead, he became a constant, terrifying reminder of what was at stake. How could they raise a family in a land where death could come from any direction, at any moment, without warning? The decision to leave was not made in the heat of a single defeat. It was a slow, agonizing conclusion reached over 3 grueling years of escalating fear. The sagas say it plainly, and with a chilling finality. They realized that though the land was good, they would always live in a state of fear and conflict with those who already lived there. They had come for a better life, for land, for wealth, for freedom. This was not it. This was a prison of fear. The departure must have been heartbreaking. It was an admission of failure on a grand scale. They dismantled the longhouses they had built with such hope. They packed their precious, irreplaceable iron tools. They loaded onto their ships, leaving behind the graves of their friends and family, buried in a land that would not have them. As they sailed away, they watched the green shore of Vinland, their failed paradise, disappear into the Atlantic mist. They were not defeated conquerors. They were refugees, fleeing a war they couldn't win. The survivors returned to Greenland. They brought with them timber, furs, and incredible, terrifying stories. But they also brought something else back: failure. And this leads to our third curveball. The Vinland venture didn't just end. It may have actively poisoned the well for the Greenland colony itself, hastening its eventual demise. Think of the investment. The ships, the hundreds of people, the tools, the livestock, the years of effort, all poured into the Vinland dream. It was a massive gamble by a small, marginal community, and it had failed spectacularly. The returning ships carried no promise of future wealth, only a warning. The endless timber supply they had hoped for would not materialize. The new pastures would remain out of reach. The entire economic and strategic justification for the Greenland colony's future was gone. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Hope is a vital resource in a place like Greenland, perhaps the most vital resource of all. The Vinland dream had been a beacon, a promise that their struggle on the edge of the world had a purpose, that a better future lay just over the western horizon. Now, that beacon was extinguished. The settlers were left to face the harsh realities of their marginal existence, but now with the added bitterness of knowing a better world was out there. But it was barred to them by an enemy they could not defeat. Did the failure of Vinland break the spirit of the Greenlanders? Did the loss of people and resources weaken the colony at a critical time, making it less resilient to the challenges to come? It's impossible to prove, but it's a powerful and logical idea. The stories of the ghostly, silent killers in the woods of Vinland would have spread through every farmstead in the small Greenlandic settlements. The dream of America had failed them, and now they were trapped on the ice with their options and their hope running out. The story of the Norse in North America doesn't end with the retreat from Vinland. It ends with a slow, silent disappearance in Greenland, a fading over centuries. For another 400 years they held on, but the world was changing around them, and time was not on their side. The primary executioner was the climate. The period of initial settlement had coincided with the medieval warm period, a time of unusually mild weather. But around the 14th century, this began to change. The planet entered a period of gradual but relentless cooling that historians now call the Little Ice Age. For Europe, it meant crop failures and famine. For the Greenland Norse, living on the absolute edge of agricultural viability, it was a death sentence. Winters grew longer and colder. The short growing season shrank even further, making it impossible to grow enough hay to keep their livestock alive through the winter. The sea lanes to Iceland and Norway, their only lifeline to the outside world, became choked with pack ice for more of the year. Trade ships, which had become less frequent anyway as Norway dealt with its own problems, like the Black Death and political union with Denmark, eventually stopped coming altogether. Without trade, there was no new iron for tools, no grain to supplement their diet, no cloth, no connection to their cultural homeland. They were completely isolated. Archaeological evidence tells a grim story. Analysis of skeletons from the later periods shows signs of severe malnutrition, rickets and other deficiency diseases. The people were getting shorter, weaker. They were slowly starving, generation by generation. Their primary export had been walrus ivory, a luxury good in Europe. But competition from Russian and African ivory sources caused the market to collapse, cutting off their main source of income. And they still weren't alone. As the Norse grew weaker, the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, were expanding south. They were masters of Arctic survival, far better adapted to the cooling climate than the Norse. While the Norse clung stubbornly to their failing European farming model, the Inuit thrived with their sophisticated technology of kayaks, harpoons, dog sleds, and snow houses. Conflict over dwindling resources like the seals at the edge of the ice floes was inevitable. The last written record from Norse Greenland is a description of a wedding held at Valsey Church in the eastern settlement, dated 1408. After that, silence. For centuries, no one knew what happened. When a missionary expedition finally arrived in the 1700s, hoping to find Vikings to convert to Protestantism, they found the farms empty, the roofs of the longhouses collapsed, the churches crumbling. The people were gone. The common theory is that they simply died out. A slow, miserable end from starvation, disease, and conflict. Some may have tried to sail back to Iceland in their final years, their ships in poor repair, lost to the stormy Atlantic. But this brings us to our final, most speculative, and most human curveball. Did they all die? Or did some of them stay? There are tantalizing clues, whispers in the historical fog. Inuit oral traditions, recorded centuries later, speak of the Tunnit, a race of giants who lived in stone houses, were physically strong but easily outwitted, and were eventually driven out or killed. Could this be a memory of their encounters with the Norse? More intriguingly, early European explorers reported seeing Inuit individuals with fair hair and blue eyes, long before extensive intermarriage could have occurred. Could some of the last, desperate Norse families seeing their society crumbling around them have made the ultimate pragmatic choice? Could they have abandoned their failing European way of life, left their cold stone farms, and assimilated into Inuit culture, choosing survival over cultural purity? It's a controversial theory, and the genetic evidence is scant and heavily debated. But it's a profoundly human possibility. That the final act of the Greenland Vikings wasn't a tragic, lonely death, but a quiet, pragmatic choice to merge with the people who knew how to survive in the land that they could not tame. That the ghosts of the Vikings may not be ghosts at all, but a faint genetic echo carried in the DNA of the people of the North. For centuries, the story of Vinland was just that. A story, a myth written down in the Icelandic sagas, tales of a far-off land of grapes and self-sown wheat. Many scholars dismissed them as folklore, seafaring pride woven into ancestral imagination. But in the 1960s, everything changed. At a place called Meadows, a windswept fishing village on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad followed the clues in the sagas and unearthed the impossible. Guided by the sagas' descriptions of the coastline, they found a series of low, overgrown mounds that looked distinctly unnatural. Excavation revealed the unmistakable outlines of sod-walled Norse longhouses, identical in construction to those in Greenland and Iceland. They found a forge for working iron, complete with slag and charcoal, proof of blacksmithing, a technology unknown to the native peoples. Most tellingly, they found a bronze-ringed pin, a common Norse cloak fastener, and a spindle whirl of soapstone, a small flywheel for a spindle used to spin wool. This tiny object was definitive proof that women were at the site, that this was a colony, not just a temporary camp of male explorers. The sagas were true. Vikings had reached the Americas 500 years before Columbus. The discovery rewrote history. It proved the incredible reach, navigational skill, and daring of these Norse seafarers. But it also confirmed the core of their story. They came, they saw, but they did not conquer. The story of the Vikings in North America is not the one we expect. It's not a tale of conquest and glory. It's a story of discovery, encounter, cultural collision, and ultimately, retreat. They were not pushed back by a superior army in a great battle, but by a superior strategy, a guerrilla war of terror and attrition that eroded their will to stay. Their failure in Vinland, the jewel they could not hold, may have even hastened their demise in Greenland, a tragic domino effect across the cold expanse of the Atlantic. They reached for a new world, and for a brief, fleeting moment they held it in their grasp. But they had the wisdom to recognise when a dream had become a nightmare, and the courage to let it go. Their legacy is not one of empire in the Americas, but a testament to the limits of power and the importance of adaptability. It is a reminder that no matter how advanced your technology or how strong your sword arm, success is never guaranteed. Sometimes the bravest and wisest thing a pioneer can do is turn around and go home. The saga of Vinland is not a story of failure, but a story of survival and the hard-won knowledge of one's own limitations in the face of a world far older and more complex than one can imagine. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the Viking Age. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, be sure to like this video, subscribe for more historical deep dives, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Norse legacy in North America. Until next time, may your sails be full and your stories never forgotten.